Daf Yomi, tractate Bava Batra, page 85b, top of the page with the words my, lav, Yehoshua Rabbi Mamash. The Gemara is asking a question. What is it not stating that the buyer's vessels affect acquisition on items on his behalf, even in the actual public domain, which contradicts Rav Papa's explanation? My lav, Yehoshua Rabbi Mamash, lo simta. It's in an alleyway. The high dumya the chater she'ena shel shneim ketani. The Gemara answers, no, this brayso is referring to an alleyway, not the actual public domain. The Gemara then counters that and asks, how can this be? What the brayso means? But the brayso teaches that it is similar to a courtyard that does not belong to either of them, meaning a location to which neither of them have any rights, whereas they both have some rights in an alleyway. Consequently, this must be referring to an actual public domain and not an alleyway. My chatzer she'ena shosnehem nami tela hai kula v'lo hai kula el ditarvayhu. The Gemara answers, what is the meaning of the phrase a courtyard that does not belong to either of them? It also refers to shared property, specifically a courtyard shared by partners, which does not belong to this one entirely, and it does not belong to that one entirely, but rather it is the property of both of them. Consequently, this courtyard is comparable to an alleyway. Boy mi Rav Sheis mi Rav Huna kile shel gan brus mocher kon lo ken kholoy am relating to ha zar koilo et kheka or et khalta harezo mi goresh. Rav Sheis raises a dilemma before Rav Huna. If the vessels of the buyer are in the domain of the seller, does the buyer acquire the merchandise once it is placed in the vessels or not? Rav Huna said to him, you learned the answer already in the Mishnah. In Gitin 77a, a wife is divorced when her husband hands her a bill of divorce, or places it in a manner that is considered equivalent to handing it to her. For example, placing in her courtyard. Accordingly, if the husband threw the bill of divorce into her lap or into her basket, this woman is divorced, even if she was in her husband's domain at that time. By the same token, even if the buyer's vessels are in the domain of the seller, they affect acquisition of the sold items on his behalf. Rav Nachman said to Rav Huna, my time of pashtule me hahi demachule mea ukle ba'ukla. Rav Nachman said to Rav Huna, what is the reason that you resolved Rav Sheishet's dilemma from that Mishnah, which it has already been struck with 100 strikes of a hammer? That's an interesting. The machuleba mea ukle de uchla. That's an interesting phrase. Mea ukle de uchla. It has been struck with 100 strikes of a hammer. It means it's been bashed up, bekitzer. It's been totally demolished. But it's an interest. Every once in a while, you'll hear these interesting phraseologies. I'm curious about that. Like, struck has been struck. His dilemma has been struck with 100 strikes of a hammer. In their analysis of the Mishnah, the sages have already inserted so many qualifications that it cannot be understood in a straightforward manner. It's been bashed up with a hammer. As Rabbi Yehuda says and Shmuel says, this halacha the Mishnah gets and applies only if her basket was hanging from her body, so that it is considered on her or in her hand. Rish Lakish says it is sufficient if it was tied to her, even if it was not hanging from her, but resting on the ground. Rav Bar Ahava says the Mishnah is referring to a case where her basket was placed between her thighs. Although it is not hanging from her, since it is placed on her body, it serves to acquire the bill of divorce on her behalf. Rabbi Shar Shiasalam V'Ramami says This is referring to a case where her husband was a basket seller, since he is not particular about the place where the basket into which he placed the bill of divorce is located. As his entire courtyard is full of baskets, it is considered as though he expressly granted her the right to make use of its location. Rabbi Yochanan amar makom cheka kanui la, makom kalta kanui la. Amar Rava my time on Rabbi Yochanan. Vishin adam makpid lo al makom cheka velo al makom kalta. Rabbi Yochanan says the place of her lab, meaning the place within her husband's property where she stands or sits, belongs to her, and the place of her basket is acquired to her. Rava said, what is the reason behind the statement of Rabbi Yochanan? It is because a person, including husband, is not particular neither about the place of her lap, nor about the place of her basket, as she requires these areas, and they do not take up much space. It is evident from all these qualifications that one cannot infer a halakhic principle from here with regard to a buyer's vessels in a seller's domain. Rather resolve the dilemma, the imbachanaduti dilemma from here. Resolve the imbachanaduti dilemma from that which was taught in the Brisa. Ela pashoit lamiho. Bishus moichel lekona ad shiyik bahenam. What should say Mishuso? My love. Bechilio de lokeach. No. Bechilio de moichel. If the merchandise was in the domain of the seller, the buyer does not acquire the merchandise until he lifts it, or until he removes it from the domain of the seller. What? Is it not referring to merchandise placed in the vessels of the buyer, which proves that the buyer's vessels do not affect acquisition of the merchandise on his behalf when they are in the seller's domain? The Gemara answers no. This does not serve as proof, as it is referring to merchandise placed in the vessels of the seller. That is why the buyer must lift or pull the merchandise to acquire it. And Meseva Bishos Lakeach came and she gave a love Moichel. The Gemara asks, but from the fact that the first clause is referring to the vessels of the seller currently understood, the latter clause must also be referring to the vessels of the seller. The latter clause. If the merchandise was in the domain of the buyer, once the seller accepts upon himself to sell an item, the buyer acquires it. And if this is referring to merchandise in the vessels of the seller, as in the earlier clause, why does the buyer acquire it? Why does the buyer acquire it? I like that one. Buyer acquire. What if the buyer was in the choir? What if the buyer was preaching to the choir? The Gemara answers, in the latter clause, we come to a different scenario. In a Bachanduti scenario, which involves the vessels of the buyer. My Paska, Satabane Milsa, Pei Moichel, Mind the Moichel Shichi, Bilakeach, Mind the Shichi. The Gemara asks, but if the clauses of the right are addressed in different cases, why was it stated without qualification? The Gemara answers, the normal way of things is that in the house of the seller, the vessels of the seller are commonly found. In the house of the buyer, the vessels of the buyer are commonly found. In some, the dilemma cannot be resolved from the Breita. Amarove, Toshima. Rav says, come in here, a solution from the Breita. Moshe, so it's back to the drawing board. We bring another proof. Try to, anyway. Rafa said, come in here, a resolution from Breita. If one pulled his donkey drivers, thereby dragging along with them the donkeys, laden with the goods, and likewise, he pulled his laborers who were carrying merchandise that he wished to purchase, and he brought them into his house, whether he fixed the price before he measured the merchandise, or whether he measured it before fixing the price, both parties can renege on the sale, provided that the merchandise has not been unloaded from the laborers or the donkeys. So we're going to attempt to prove something which will be further elaborated on Mr. Shem in tomorrow's Daf.